Welcome to the Our Retro Gaming Podcast. My name is Genovi, and I'm joined by my co-host Rob of Retro Game Living Room and special guest host Steve from Wired Up Retro and the Atari 5200 podcast. Today's guest is David Crane, an early Atari game developer who later co-created Activision in 1979, where he would become known for designing the 1982 Game of the Year, Pitfall. With that, let's jump right into it.
All right, David. Well, you were born at a time when people didn't grow up with computers. How did you get interested in programming, and what was your first experience with a video game?
Well, ironically, there were IBM computers back in the 60s. And growing up, I was a Boy Scout. And I was one of the first people to earn the computer programming merit badge in Boy Scouts.
Wow, what age were you at when that happened?
Oh, wow. 14, something like that.
Cool.
Which is, decades before any of you were born, practically. But it was coincidentally my scoutmaster worked in a data processing center at a company and had an IBM 360. And so he became both the scoutmaster and the instructor, and I went into his office and got to fool around. Then I also had another opportunity in high school. Again, this is long before home computers, so if you were going to have access to a computer, it was going to be through something special. And I got involved in an educational extension that had computer programming. I actually learned how to program a computer in 3 languages in high school. So I left high school programming computers, I was one of, a handful of people around capable of doing that.
So what was your first experience with a video game then? When did that come?
I saw video games, of course, when Pong came out. I don't think, I think back to Tank, which was one of Key Games' first games, arcade games, put in the quarters and play Tank against another player. And I was walking through an arcade with a friend, and, he pulled me aside and says, "This thing is really cool. It's really impressive." And I had a lot of electronics background, and I could look at that screen and actually tell you how it was doing what it was doing. So unlike a lot of players who, concentrate mostly about what it's like to play the games, I look at a game and figure out how it works and how it's doing what it's doing. So I see it almost with X-ray vision. I see it from the inside of what the game is doing. So that was my interest in arcade games. This is cool. This is a neat use of both computers and electronics and televisions and all those things that are cool. And so I was kind of hooked.
Going from that perspective, looking at it as a game designer, what are some games that you admired other than Tank before you became a professional game designer?
Well, certainly Computer Space was very impressive. It was, insane, and of course couldn't be produced in any reasonable cost. But, having gravity and spaceships flying and all that sort of thing, that was very impressive. Al Alcorn did a game, early arcade game called Space Race, where you were operating a spaceship on left or right of the screen if you were the left or right player, and you were trying to get your way through asteroid belts, and if you hit an asteroid, you died, that sort of thing. And I must have liked that because I borrowed from that when I made the game Freeway. I mean, I made no secret of the fact that Freeway is basically Space Race done with chicken. But every game has something fun and unique about it technologically. So it's hard to really separate out any particular example other than those.
What about since you became a professional game designer? Is there any that you look at now or throughout your career and go, wow, that really has something special?
You're asking me to make a judgment on, what do they say, 200, 300, 400,000 games that have been done since I started?
Yeah, just what stands out to you.
That's kind of like I said, every game is kind of unique. I'm often asked, which of my games have something fun about them, and almost every one of them had something that enticed me to do it. But most video games are evolutionary, not revolutionary. The first idea of bouncing a dot across the screen was revolutionary. And then there were some other interesting things, but mostly you just evolved. You evolved from a dot to a character and moving the character around. And then you always had to deal with the characters colliding with one another. Then, something had to happen on the screen once they did that, whether the ball bounces or character dies because it touched something evil or whatever. So, it really, there isn't a period in time where after, Pong and those games, that really anything revolutionary happened. VR came out and we said, oh, that's kind of interesting. We'll see what happens. But they're really all just evolutions of the things we did back in the 70s and 80s with better technology every year.
Hey, David, it's Steve here. I have a quick question about the game Freeway, which you said is a lot like Space Race. If you ask most 2,600 fans what they think of when they think of Freeway, they think, well, it's basically a knockoff of Frogger. So I did take it upon myself to take a look at the date that Frogger actually came out versus the date that Freeway came out. And Frogger came out June 5th, 1981. And all I know about Freeway is it just says 1981 and it's got your name on it. So I figured maybe you could help decide which came first, the chicken or the frog.
Yeah, well, it's actually kind of funny. All the development back then was done in total secret. So Frogger was being developed in Japan in total secrecy, and Freeway was being developed in Mountain View, California in total secrecy. And they came out just about at the same time. So one is not a clone of the other. It's independent development, 6,000 miles apart, all done in secret.
And there were no threats of lawsuits or anything like that, right, back then?
A lot of threats of lawsuits over the years, but I don't think there was ever one about Freeway and Frogger.
Good to know. Good to know. And another thing, I have a question from a friend of mine who's on the Atari 5200 podcast with me. And he wanted me to ask you if there are any extras in the Atari 5200 conversion of Pitfall. Your name is on the Pitfall booklet for the 5200, I believe, as a designer, although you didn't really do the programming for it like you did on the 2600. But, the 5200 is a more powerful piece of hardware. Do you know of anything that was done differently compared to the original version? And I guess I could also ask that question about Decathlon or Kaboom. But yeah, let's just concentrate on Pitfall at the moment.
Yeah, we were just talking about Decathlon. We were showcasing our Decathlon boxes. I think it's pretty impressive that you don't actually see this anymore, where you actually have the creator's name showcased prominently on the front of a box. I think that's
Here's my box right here. It's got his name right here on the box. Yeah, it's cool.
I mean, it had to be revolutionary when something like this came out with the actual developer's, the programmer's name on the box itself. I'm not to take away from Steve's question.
Well, let's return to that question because it's a big issue that happened back in those days. But the development of the Atari 800/5200 Pitfall is actually a fascinating story. Nowadays, if you put out a game, you put it out for 6 different platforms simultaneously, or at least very close to simultaneously. The development is done that way. We never did that. I think Pitfall 2 is the first sequel in video games. So we didn't plan on it in advance, but Pitfall was very successful. So we said, well, let's put it on other platforms. So we brought in 2 guys to simultaneously develop the Atari 800 version and the Commodore 64 version. Now, both are 6502 processors with more power than the Atari 2600 as far as the video display is concerned. And they took 2 different directions in the development. The guy who did the C64 said, okay, Pitfall exists in my hands, because we were really doing Pitfall 2 on those systems, not Pitfall 1 at the time. He said, I will use the existing Pitfall 2 game as a specification. I know exactly what it's supposed to do because I can turn it on and I can play it. And I'm going to write a C64 version that does everything that the 2600 version does. And so he went that direction, which is sort of a traditional development process. And then Mike Lorenzen decided to go a different direction. He said, this thing is written in 6502. So the only difference between a perfect port of the 2600 game and the Atari 800 game is going to be in the display code. So he wrote display code to hook into the game code that I had already written using the Atari 2600 version. So he was doing a port of the video, ported to a different machine and displaying it in a different way, but keeping all the game logic. And the other guy, Tim, was doing the other direction, is just creating a whole new game. And they finished at about the same time. So as a test case, it was kind of interesting. But when Tim finished his Commodore 64 version, it was beta and was full of bugs, as all games are when you get to that point. So you have to debug for who knows how long, for maybe a month. He spent debugging his code to get the whole thing working, since it was completely rewritten from scratch code. Mike Lorenzen, on the other hand, as soon as he hit enter on the final change of the graphics, all of the gameplay logic was in and running. So he had a completed, debugged game ready to go. So they finished at the same time to beta, but Mike Lorenzen was well past beta. He had the code fully debugged because he was using my debugged code. And he sat there on his hands saying, okay, these games are going to be released simultaneously. Tim's got a month of work to do bug testing. What am I going to do? So Mike Lorenzen wrote the entire second world, laid out an entire second world that starts after you finish the first one. So you get to the end of Pitfall 2, you have rescued Rhonda from the giant cave rat or whatever that game was, and somehow you ran into Quick Claw, the cowardly lion, which was borrowed from the cartoon show that was going on simultaneously. Anyway, and it opens a door, and now you go through and you have another world as big as the original world to learn a whole new game. And so, yes, it is the Atari 800/5200 version is far better than the original in that it has an entire second world that you get to play. Now, as for Pitfall One, I don't have any recollection of how Pitfall One was done for those various machines. I imagine it was. I mean, was Pitfall One on the 5200? Can you confirm that for me?
Right. Yeah, that was a game on the 5200,
Yeah.
and really looked about the same as the 2600 version. It didn't have any extra music or anything like that on board.
Yeah, I think that was just a port done maybe even by a third party. I was long off onto other things. I mean, that's the thing about anytime you were taking a finished game from our original work and porting it onto another platform, we didn't have to be involved. Our value was in coming up with brand new, great creative games, something new and moving on. So I really didn't have much interaction with any of the ports. And then, of course, we licensed the title to Nintendo for an arcade game and to Sega for this. And with all these licenses, everybody always asks me about those, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh versions. I had absolutely nothing to do with any of those.
So going back to getting your name on a box, I mean, that seems like it was very revolutionary just to see this. I mean, that is, when I'm looking at the Decathlon, is that like one of the first instances of that, or one of the only instances where the creator is prominently displayed on the box like that?
Well, I don't know about the box exactly, but that was a founding principle of Activision, quite simply. We all came from Atari. We had all worked together at Atari. And we were able to find out from sales figures and such that there were four of us who were making the games that everybody liked the best. Four of us in a department of 30 people, plus accounting for 60% of Atari's revenues. And so we went to the management of Atari and said, obviously we're good at this. We'd like to be compensated as if we're good at it. A royalty, anything like that. And Atari management basically told us we were no more important than the person on the assembly line who put them together, because they were a corporate cog as well as we were a corporate cog. And anyway, so we weren't important. What we felt was we were as important as the author of a book. And if you look at a book, you've got the title of the game and the author's name. And in fact, the more popular the author is, the larger his name. You will actually find books where the author's name is larger than the book title, which is a little strange, I think. But so when we left Atari to found Activision, that was the primary founding principle: is game creators are the same as authors of a book and should be credited for their work. If you market it that way, you can actually find people who like the David Crane game so much they went out and bought the next one. So there was actually even an advantage to that. So I think our names are on all the boxes, but maybe mostly on the back. And of course, we're all over the inside of the game as well. But that was the starting place of that. Activision was the first third-party publisher of video game software in the first place.
Yes.
We made cartridges and nobody else did. And now, if you look around, everybody is a third-party, developer or publisher.
Sure.
I was at a game developers conference and asked for a show of hands. I said, how many people, 600 people in the audience, are, third-party publishers or developers? And everybody raised their hands except like 6 guys standing against the sidewall from Sony, because they made games for the Sony PlayStation, and so they're first-party. There are first-party developers, but mostly it's third-party. That's what Activision created. And in doing that, we also decided we wanted to have credit given to the people who do the creations. And some of us became better known than others, and so ended up with our names on the front of the box, or you might say David Crane's, with the game name or whatever. But the whole idea was that we felt that the game developer should be credited for his work.
So my next question is actually about third-party developers in a way. It's also about the video game crash, which is a really interesting topic that someone could probably write a whole book on just that one event. I've listened to a bunch of your interviews, and you've previously stated that you feel like there was a glut of product due to excess third parties that were primarily the cause of the crash. You say that you went to a game development, maybe an expo, and you saw all these third parties there, and you're thinking, well, these guys aren't going to make it. Do you have any particular developers in particular that you point that blame at? And do you think there's any other contributing factors to the crash?
Well, no, it's exactly as I've said before. I went to a consumer electronics show, and the previous show, they happen every 6 months, and the previous show, there were 3 companies making games for the Atari 2600. And that was Atari, Activision, and Imagic. The Magic started shortly after us. It was another bunch of guys that we had worked with. And after we left, everybody said, well, that looks like a good idea. Let's go too. And, they did some great games as well. And the industry was ripe for that. I mean, it was really time to spin off and get credit for the work that you're doing. But also because of that, there was a lot of money being made. And it was primarily because we were doing really good games. I mean, we had to do better games than Atari. Of course, that's a subjective measurement, but we had to do that because otherwise you go into a store and you own an Atari and you see all these Atari games. And then you see this young upstart company called Activision. And I mean, Gary Kitchen, tells the story that when he walked into the store and he first saw Activision games on the shelf, his first reaction was, oh, these things have got to be crap. Somebody coming up with games and it's not Atari?
Yeah.
So we worked really hard to make the games as good as we possibly could, and at least as good as what Atari was putting out. And we wouldn't have succeeded if we hadn't. So there was a lot of money being made, as I say, and people looked around and said, hey, I can do that. I mean, how many people have told you I can design a game? you know?
Yeah.
I can tell you a lot of people have told me that. And so in that 1 6-month period, 30 games started up. Some venture capitalists said, I'd like to get a piece of this and put a couple $1 million up. And some people said, I can just hire some programmers. Don't need to be special to make video games. And so they made a lot of games that were just ridiculous. Specifically, I mean, a game called Lost Luggage is, just a little weak in my opinion.
And that was by US Game, US Gold?
US Game, I think it was US Game.
US Games.
Apollo Games.
Apollo Games, thank you.
It's one of those. And I mean, Kennel Ration or Quaker Oats was making games. I mean, there were, again, 30 publishers in a 6-month period. And as I've said before, I looked at that list and I said, well, half of these at least are going to be out of business. This is hard. They don't realize how hard it is to make a quality game. What I didn't realize is when they went out of business, what they would do to the video game business, and they ended up crashing the business. So if you think about these 30 companies all going out of business, they've all put a couple $1 million into making cartridges, and they got a warehouse full of cartridges. And, we're trying to sell cartridges at $35, $40 a piece. And some enterprising bottom feeder comes in and they go to these companies, and out of bankruptcy, they say, I'll tell you what, we will buy all of those games that you've got there for $3 a piece. And then they go to a retailer, and like KB Toys at the time, and said, we'll sell them to you for $4 and you can retail them for $5. We make $1, you make $1, and everybody's happy. And that Christmas in 1983, you walk into KB Toys, and before you could even get back to see Pitfall 2 or whatever games were, the hot current games, you would pass a barrel full of cartridges at $5 a piece.
By these third-party fly-by-night developers that went under.
And got their games were all bought out of bankruptcy and sold for that. So the dad would come in. He'd been told to buy a particular game by his kid for $40, and he brings his $40 in, and he says, I can buy 8 games for this $40, and I can go home and wrap them all up, and I can be the hero. Or I can go back and buy the $40 game. And that Christmas, sales of Frontline, previously never sold before games, went to zero. People never even got to the back of the store where the expensive games were.
Something that I always find kind of interesting with the whole video game crash is that we always hear from our, overseas counterparts about how it's a very American-centric problem, how they never really experienced it over there in England or the rest of Europe or in Australia. And I wonder if you were actually dealing with those markets at the time, and if you actually seen a decline in those markets during that period, or if that's really what kept you guys afloat.
Well, I can't say I recall specifically, but the Atari 2600 business was an America-centric business. We had to make special versions to run on PAL and CCAM. And so we really didn't tend to do that until we were pretty sure we had a game that would be successful in the European market. And I think these fly-by-night companies didn't make PAL versions. So the glut was in NTSC versions. So right there, it limits it to the Americas, or North America only, because South America was also PAL. And so from that standpoint, it's a different market. You're actually creating an entirely different product for sale overseas. Selling overseas was also very challenging. So there were fewer products in the market, less inventory to worry about. We sold to Italy. I did a PR tour in Italy and spent a lot of time talking to the guys there. And the Italian government was putting such stiff tariffs on products from the US because they wanted to support businesses in Italy, which is what governments do. That's why they put tariffs on things. That you could buy a color TV in Italy for less than the cost of an Atari 2600 console. So, we were thinking about the console as kind of like a sideline to the TV. Well, now the console is more expensive than your TV. So they didn't sell very many of them. And same thing with cartridges. They were tripling the cost of the cartridge by these huge tariffs. So the European market was entirely different than the American market. So it had a smaller boom and a smaller bust, I would have to say.
Now, going back to the crash for a moment, everyone that we've talked to has their own theory. Some say retail glut. So it sounds like there may have been some retail glut in buying these barrels and barrels of games. And one thing that Nolan Bushnell put forward was that the Atari 2600 had reached its penetration and overstayed its welcome. It was kind of an aging console when Activision started developing games for it. At what point do you think that it overstayed its welcome, and do you think that its lower end technology helped to cause that crash? Because it was really a 2600 centric crash too.
Well, the Atari 2600, what Nolan, he makes a good point that Atari should have been making these, successor to the Atari 2600, and they were just ignoring the future, and they suffered the consequences. That's why Atari in its current form is nothing like the original company.
No.
Not at all.
But the Atari 2600 did last unbelievably long. I mean, it lasted a good 10 years when hardware generally lasts a couple of years. And you'll see a new console come out about every 2 years. And the technology is infinitely better each time. So there is that. I mean, we loved making games for the Atari 2600, so much so that I tried to keep it alive for an extra year or two when I created a custom integrated circuit for Pitfall 2. The idea was that we couldn't make the Atari 2600 any better since it was already out there. It was sitting on grandma's shelf and you couldn't change the hardware. But every time you plugged in a new game, you changed the overall game system, the combination. So Pitfall 2 has a custom integrated circuit in it that made the Atari 2600 have more capability. That's why there's really more sprites per screen on Pitfall 2. There's the music. There's a lot of other stuff. So that was my attempt to keep the Atari 2600 alive, and I think it kept it alive for another year or so. But
go ahead.
Well, while Nolan's statement is a true statement that it was very long in the tooth, I don't think it had anything to do with the crash, because the whole idea of video game consoles is you're going to make some money on the console, but you're going to make most of your money on the software. It's the razor blade scenario. And the glut in the market made it so that you couldn't make a profit selling video game cartridges. And so there's no sustainable business once you've done that.
All right, so Activision did something that I don't think any other third-party developer during the time succeeded in doing. You mentioned Magic. They tried and failed to do the same thing. You guys survived the crash. What did you do differently? What was the strategy for weathering the storm?
Well, the crash was very hard to survive. One factor that helped is we had an IPO. Activision had gone public, and you do that to raise money so that you can move into the next business. So we had some cash in the bank that we could use that to help survive the transition. But the fact of the matter is when you have no revenues coming in, it's hard to make a sustainable business. So what our CEO, Jim Levy, did, and I was impressed with this. I don't know if it's what anybody would do, but we had layoffs. And in fact, the layoffs at Activision were as sad as they would be at any other company. And the local media descended upon the company. They got wind that Activision was having layoffs. And so there were news trucks in the parking lot.
Wow.
And they grabbed people as they were leaving. And they knew who was leaving because there were tears in their eyes, right?
Yeah.
And they, grabbed them, got them aside, and started asking them what's going on and for sound bites and such. And to a man and a woman, nobody had anything negative to say. Activision was a wonderful place to work, and it was just made clear that with no revenues coming in, something had to be done. And what Jim Levy did was he looked at the business as it's going to be going forward. We had a business plan that we had written, 5 years before, and we had a plan of what we were going to do. But things change. So he said, all right, if I can assume this moderate growth back in the industry, getting sales going back, yada, yada, I'm going to design a plan for a company that can survive in this market with these revenues. And then he effectively designed a new company, completely designed how it was going to be, where there would be staffing positions and such. And then with that in hand, go back to the old company and say who working in the old company is a perfect fit in the new company. And so, you hear about people, we're going to lay off 30% of our workforce because we need, to survive this downturn or whatever. He didn't do anything like that. He created a new company going forward and populated it with people from the old company. And there were 30% left over who didn't fit in the new company, for example. So, I mean, it was a brilliant way to do it. Like I said, I don't know if that's normal. If I had gone to Harvard Business School, somebody would have told me that this is how it's done. I don't know. But I saw it being done, and it was done really well. Unfortunately, even his very careful projections didn't come true. The crash lasted longer than we thought. And the biggest transition that was actually made in Activision was to move from video game consoles to home computers. And that was in our original business plan from 5 years before. We saw that the video game console with the Atari was just a huge thing right now. Nobody had ever seen anything like it before, so it was great. Everybody wanted to have one in their house, and every kid wanted to play. But the home computer was slowly building itself up at the same time. So we drew a couple curves. We said, here's the video game curve. It's going to boom, and then it's going to start to peel off as the home computer continues to rise. And we picked a point in 1985 where the two lines crossed and said by 1985, Activision will have been transitioned out of video game console and into home computer software, assuming that they'd be able to do everything that a video game could do. And so we started doing more home computer software quicker than we really wanted to because of the revenues drop in the Atari 2600. But all of those factors combined kept the company pretty much alive up until that point or a year after that point.
Now, you would eventually leave Activision, and you've talked a lot about why you did that, and there was a bonus structure that kind of forced you out that couldn't be explained to you. But what I really am curious about is the gradual change in the corporate climate. So what was it like when you started versus the time that you ended?
Well, of course, when we started, there were only 5 of us. And so it was very entrepreneurial, and everybody wore multiple hats and did multiple things. We had a small 800 square foot office where the lab was in the kitchen. And if people came to get coffee, they had to walk by our screens and bother us. So it was very small, but we grew very fast. And sometimes that's difficult to grow. But I think Activision did it really well. But the whole idea was it was all about being creative and creating products. A lot of the corporate structures, like the one that at Atari that we had to leave, became less about making products and creating things that were new and innovative, and being run by a person from the packaged goods business. And so Activision didn't really have that kind of a corporate problem, but the problem is about a year after Jim Levy did this amazing thing that I told you about, company was still not turning a profit. Board of directors gave up on him. They'd made $300 million from our work. And then they decided, all right, we're just going to fire Jim Levy, bring in a person who was totally incompetent, in my opinion. And that's the primary reason that I left. The company was gutted by the removal of Jim Levy, and the lack of caring about new products and creativity.
So I'm really curious if there were any games that you actually worked on that were close to completion or completed and never released, that you would have liked to have seen come to market, and if you might tell us about those if there was.
Well, there were actually a number of games like you described. However, they didn't come to market because I didn't want them to come to market. I can't think of any situation where I had a game and, nobody liked it enough to market. Well, I don't know. I suppose there was one game in there. I did a Hangman game that must not have come out, but it was just not. Well, maybe it did come out. I don't know. I did a Commodore 64 version of our 2600 Bridge, but it was just a real quickie without anything fancy or good graphics. We didn't put that out. But there was a lot of experimentation that had to be done to make the Atari 2600 do cool stuff. And I would sometimes work for months and have something that was really, really cool, but just didn't quite make it. It wasn't fun enough to play. I did a motocross game, and side view of a motorcycle. It's 32 bits wide, using the 4 8-bit wide splits that you get on Atari. I gave it a suspension that bobbed up and down, so each piece moved independently. I ran it along a dirt field, and the wheels bumped on it, kind of looked like Moon Patrol with the wheels bumping on the thing as they went, and I ended up using all of the Atari 2600's capabilities to make the motocross and the motorcycle and playfield that there was nothing left to put on the screen to do. You couldn't pick up things, couldn't do this, couldn't do that. So I just basically got to the point, I cannot make this game fun. So I put it on the shelf and started on the next thing. I did a motorcycle jumping game, and it kind of used combination of the decathlon stadium and the dragster controls. And so you would accelerate first, second, third, and fourth, getting your motorcycle going as fast as you can. You'd hit a ramp and it would fly, see how far you could fly, and it would tell you how many feet you flew and that sort of thing. And it was just kind of boring, not worthy of an Activision title. So it went on the shelf as well. And unfortunately, before guys like the National Video Game Museum started dumpster diving around Atari and Activision and trying to save some of this stuff, it all got lost. The video game business has been notoriously bad at preserving things. It's in part because it's like, oh, these are our secrets. This is our intellectual property, so we can't let it go out. We have to shred this and delete that and that sort of thing. So any of those games that did not end up going into ROM were lost forever.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting with the 5200. We've seen games like Tempest, which were fairly deep into development when Atari canned the 5200. So that just it never got completed, and then years later, Steve probably knows more about it than I do, but they
it's in 2012.
Yeah, they find the guy and he still has the code, and they actually get him to complete it and release it. And so there's always instances like that when a system comes out and ends up leaving the marketplace sooner than what some of these companies might anticipate.
Yeah, somebody must have held on to that ROM despite the fact that Atari probably wanted it destroyed. But I'm really glad it didn't get destroyed. It turned out to be a wonderful game. David, I would love to see you do some homebrew games for the Atari 2600, 5200, anything like that. Boy, with your name being as popular in the Atari crowd as it is, I think you'd probably be able to sell quite a few of your games on the Atari Age website and other websites if you were to endeavor into doing that, even into your retirement years. It could be something that
well, I've made video games for 40 years on 25 different consoles, so I obviously enjoy doing it. The 2600 has always been my favorite, and I think about what you're talking about all the time.
I like.
However, if I were to do it, it would not be homebrew.
Yeah.
Okay. I've heard someone use the term pro brew. I don't like that term either.
We use the term aftermarket release because the market has left the console. It's no longer supported, but there is high quality, full on production games coming out. Even for I'm really into the Mega Drive, and we're seeing actual development studios with professional people that worked on AAA titles creating games. So these are not homebrews; they're aftermarket releases. Is I think probably the best term for them.
Yeah, if I were to do it, I would do it in that way.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Let's do it. Yeah.
we would be ecstatic.
Okay, so David, I read on Wikipedia that back in 2012, you had a Kickstarter that unfortunately didn't make its goal for producing a new jungle adventure game. And can you tell us just a little bit more about that?
Well, it was in an era when a lot of the old school game people were bringing back some ideas, and everybody said, well, gee, you ought to do that. And the biggest issue was I wasn't going to do a game without a professional budget. Wasn't going to do a game without being able to pay professional artists, sound effects, music, programming, all of those things. And so I ran a budget, and I couldn't do a game in that day and age for less than $600,000. That's how much it costs to bring in professional people to work for a year. And there was a lot of pushback on that. I don't exactly understand why. The whole idea with a Kickstarter game is you think you're funding the development, and to some extent you are, but you're doing it by buying a game before it's made. It's all you're doing is you're doing a pre-order. So you have to trust that the people who are going to be making the game will be able to complete the game. I didn't think we had any trust issues. I mean, if I say I'm going to make a game, I'm going to make a game. But it just turned out that the internet haters got involved and said, we're not going to involve ourselves in a game that costs $600,000 to make. And who cares? Why do you care? And unfortunately, this is my first time dealing with the internet haters, and it's just amazing. There are
a lot of them.
And there's a lot of them, and they get to express their opinion as if their opinion is as important as anybody else's, and it's one of the problems with social media these days.
Yeah.
So it did not fund. So no development was done on it. We had some sketches for characters that we were going to use, and we still have that, I suppose. But it was not a pleasant experience. So it's probably not something I would repeat.
Was that for Steam, like PC, and or was it for specific game systems like PlayStation 4 and Xbox One and that type of thing?
Yeah, we were going to be doing it on Unity, so it could be done on the iOS platforms and Android platforms and on PC and Steam. I mean, these days, multiple development or multiple targets are real easy to deal with. Unity is a good platform for development, and then you can export it to various places. It's just like that story that I told about the Pitfall 2 on the Atari 800 is you write the game, so the game code is one entity, and then you write the display capability, using some other generic method like with the way Unity does, and then it can be exported onto different players.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. That's insightful, and I can understand why you probably wouldn't want to jump back onto a Kickstarter project.
Rack the Undead asks, did you ever have any trepidation about forging your own path with Activision? Would you ever consider, or what would you consider your greatest success in your career?
Well, I'll tell you, when I started Activision, it was very much jumping off the deep end. I mean, it was going from a company that was paying a salary. I went to with a startup. We weren't getting paid. In fact, we were paying money in. You actually buy into a startup so that you buy your original stock, and that's part of the money that's used for developing the company. I didn't have money for gas. I was walking to work. I was eating tuna sandwiches for lunch. I was brown bagging it to lunch. All those things that not having the money to go out to eat or whatever. So there was a lot of risk. But of course, I was also doing something I loved and doing it for myself now. And so the fact that I was working into the wee hours, even if I went home for dinner, I'd walk back to the office and work all night, So it was risky, but it was cool. It was the most fun thing I've ever done. Greatest accomplishment? I don't know. Creating the third-party video game publishing business is a big deal, particularly the way it came out. I'd hate to say that Activision, which happened 40 years ago, was my greatest accomplishment, because then I'm done. My life's over. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, but one of the harder things I've done is every time a new game console comes out, I'd have to learn the console, learn the language, learn how to use it, figure out how to make games with it. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I have developed games, published games on more than 20, closer to 25 consoles or systems. That includes mobile, J2ME, Brew, different languages, different systems, different consoles, and programmed professionally in almost as many languages, somewhere 24, 25 different computer programming languages. So every time a new console came out, most of the work that I had to do, you didn't get to see. It was all new, all learning, all creating, In fact, every time a new console came out, we had to redo our tools. We had to make graphic tools and drawing tools and sound tools and music tools and graphic compressors and sound compressors and decompressors that ran on the console. All of those things we had to do every time a new console came out every 2 years. So my greatest body of work is by doing what I've been doing on so many different consoles.
It's quite impressive to have such a long-lasting career. You think about other people who have been in the industry for a long period of time, and it's there's not very many names. Like Kojima comes to mind, or there's a handful of people, but the reality is a lot of times you see somebody come in and they're in the industry for 5 or 10 years, and then they go off into something else non-video game related. So I think it's very impressive for you to have been
involved.
The
simple fact of the matter is it's not easy. This stuff is not easy to do.
Reddit Shreddit asks, were you happy with the settlement agreement between Activision and Atari? What would you do if you were directing a reimagined Pitfall on a modern system?
Well, there's two completely different philosophical questions. The lawsuit with Atari was a learning experience. Nothing bad came of it. When we started the company, we had budgeted $40,000 for legal fees because we knew first thing Atari would do, they would sue us. And we hired one of the highest, best reputation intellectual property attorneys to advise us before we left. The guy's name was Aldo Test. And in the lawsuit, when they said, so who did you talk to? And we mentioned Aldo Test, they blanched. They said, well, if you did everything he told you to do, then we've got no lawsuit, right? And, so basically it came down to a very simple matter of there was a deal struck between the two companies rather than continue to spend legal fees. And it was a very small, minuscule settlement. I do not know the actual details. That way I could not divulge them because it was a confidential settlement. Jim Levy asked us all, said, do you want to know? And I said, not really. And so, those of us, except for Jim Levy, don't know exactly what the settlement was, but it's a few pennies here or there. Oh, and the other question, what was the second part of that question?
The second part is, what would you do if you were directing a reimagined Pitfall on a modern system?
Well, Pitfall has been done on modern systems. It was called Uncharted. So when I envisioned the jungle adventure, and the jungle venture is kind of a play on words. We created a new venture to make a jungle. I stuck with 2.5D, and I did that for a very good reason. We're now pretty much comfortable with 3D games. Everybody has first-person shooters, and you do a reasonably good job these days. You have enough processing power to handle terrain collisions and that sort of thing. But for the longest time, 3D games were not very playable. You swing at a guy and miss him completely, and yet it registers as a collision. And there was just a lot of difficulty in making the games fun in 3D. I've loved 2D for that reason. I mean, a 2D collision is a 2D collision. I can give you a pixel-to-pixel collision. You touched the guy, right? And 2.5D is basically just that. It's done with sliding, different backgrounds at different depths. So you have a foreground and then middle grounds and all the way background, and you scroll them side to side at different rates, and you get a really nice 3D look to your game. And because it's not 3D, we call that 2.5D. So Jungle Venture was going to be a 2.5D Pitfall. Couldn't call it Pitfall because Activision owns that trademark, and I was no longer involved with Activision. But that was my envisioning of Pitfall on a modern system.
Just stated the obvious, wants to know, did you create the music for Pitfall 2's extra chip? And if so, did you compose other chiptune music which wasn't used?
Well, when I was doing Pitfall 2, we had already licensed Pitfall to Saban to make a Saturday morning cartoon. And ironically, I don't have any of those. I've seen a couple of them on YouTube that are horrible quality. I always wish that I had gotten, good quality videos of those Saturday morning cartoons so I could have them. But they were not very well received. The storylines were not very interesting. But they had created Quick Claw, the character. They had created Pitfall Harry's niece, Rhonda. And they created a nice theme song for the cartoon. So while I was looking at doing music for Pitfall 2 and making the hardware do it, I went back to Jim Levy and I said, can we cross-license that tune? I'd like to use that in Pitfall 2. I like it. So he went back and just, we're licensing them the game, they're licensing us the movie. It's just a cross-license deal. Now, that said, that was played by a studio orchestra. And turning it into chip music was something else. So yes, I created the arrangement of that song. I did not compose the song, but I arranged it for my hardware, which was three channels, basically a melody, a harmony, and a percussion channel, and created that tune. As for composition, I then did a minor tune variation of it, or minor key variation of it that is my composition, which was when you were dying and returning back to the last red cross that you had touched. And it slowed down and it was minor keyed, so that is, I guess, my composition, certainly a version that I made of it.
Yeah, you definitely have some musical talent because of all the Atari 2600 music, I would say that is the most in tune and really nice sounding soundtrack of all of the games. I can't think of another game that outperforms Pitfall 2 on the music side. So,
well, to be fair, Pitfall 2 did it with hardware. The Atari 2600 had 255 different tones that it could put out. Well, it's actually more than that because there are different waveforms and different divisors and other things like that. But it was basically dividing down from the CPU clock and use it as a tone. So you get a beep and a bloop and whatever. Yeah. And it turns out there are about somewhere, depending on how close you want to be, somewhere between 9 and 17 notes that actually are somewhat chromatic. They happen to land on the right notes. Um,
I did not know that. That's pretty
Oh, yeah.
awesome. Yeah,
So-
that's neat.
So you can write a tune that uses only those notes, and it will sound in tune. It's not something anybody did for many years. Gary Kitchen had the solution that was wonderful. If you listen to the music in Pressure Cooker, it's got a beautiful jingle. So it's a fabulous jingle, and it's done without hardware.
That is a nice one. Yeah, you're right.
It's the nicest one that isn't using hardware like Pitfall 2. And the way he did it is he took out his little Casio keyboard and played each note the Casio played and played each note the Atari could play and listened to them and said, this is close enough to that note. So he put a little black electrical tape on the Casio keyboard button that said, this is a key that can be used. Then he went out and hired a professional jingle writer who had done jingles for television shows and commercials and that sort of thing, brought him in and said, here's the video game. They played it. So this is what, now you know what it's like, give you an idea. Here's the philosophy or whatever. I'd like you to write a jingle. And the guy says, great. Then he said, and look at this keyboard. These are the only notes you can use.
Yep.
And he did a beautiful job. I mean, so I think Pressure Cooker is the best non-hardware assisted jingle in the Atari world.
I think we'll all be plugging in Pressure Cooker here pretty quick.
Constant Nerve wants to know if you taught a DigiPen summer workshop around 2003 to 2004, and if you did, he wants to thank you for your work there.
DigiPen?
Yeah, 2003.
I'm not familiar with it, so it was probably not me.
Okay.
I mean, I've done GDC talks and other things like that where I try to break down stuff, and you can see me at a lot of retro gaming shows talking about how this stuff was done. But I have not actually officially taught any classes.
Just Stated the Obvious also wants to know how you would have used the Ghostbuster license and wants to know what you thought about the games that did release on the NES 2600 and Master System, if you're familiar with them.
Well, Ghostbusters is an interesting story in the video game development. There was a time that video games did not license properties. I was at Atari, and my family liked to play Boggle, a Parker Brothers game with 16 cubes with letters on them, and you shake them up and they go into a 4x4 grid, and you come up with how many words can you make with adjacent cubes. And I did a Boggle game on the Atari 2600. Never exactly finished it. It was not polished, but it was fully functional. When I went to my boss and I said, this is a cool game. Everybody loves playing it. Belongs to Parker Brothers. It's called Boggle. You'll probably have to go out and get a license for Boggle to put this out. And him and his boss both looked at me and said, we don't license other people's properties to put in our games. We license our games to other people. It was just, we're Atari. We don't license from other people. Well, obviously that changed dramatically. And so Ghostbusters in 1986-ish, I don't remember what it was still at a time where that was not being done very much. You weren't licensing products. As a result, the studios weren't necessarily going out to video game companies and trying to license their movies. Now, of course, that's done before the first scene is shot. They've got a company licensing the video game rights or whatever. So we were brought Ghostbusters shortly before it was going to be in theaters, and got the script, and they said, gee, I wonder if any of these video game companies might like to make a Ghostbusters game. Read the script, loved the script. You never know if the movie's going to be as good as the script or better. You just never know how the performances are going to go, but still it looked like using the Saturday Night Live cast, and looked like it was going to be pretty good. So we told our guys, go ahead and go back and negotiate that license. But in the lab, we had this discussion and realized, this movie's about to come out. If we put out a Ghostbusters game a year after the Ghostbusters movie comes out, there's a good chance that the license will have no value anymore. It'll have run its course. We didn't know that Ghostbusters was going to become the cult hit that it became, but there was the risk that it wouldn't be of value, and it takes a year to make a game. So since we only had a few months, I said, the only way we're going to make this game is I'm going to take the game I'm working on now, and I'm going to retask it to be in the Ghostbusters universe. I was developing a game. The working title was Car Wars, and it had an in-game economy, which is, I think, one of the first in-game economies in video games, where you would earn money and you would go back to the shop and you would buy stuff and you would put it on your car, machine guns and, bulletproof this and whatever. And then you would go out and you would run a gamut. You would go out and you would fight other cars on the road. And it was not a new concept. There had been books done, very similar concepts. And it was a real nice, catchy title. I mean, Car Wars, what could you say? We were after Star Wars, of course. So I tore that game apart, and I kept the in-game economy where you put items on your car. I mean, this time that we can ghost vacuums and traps and other stuff. I kept the scrolling world where you're driving your car back and forth, and had ghosts come flying in at that time. I kept the map view where you could navigate the city streets and decide I'm going here and going here, doing that, and turn the whole thing into using that game in the Ghostbusters universe. And I had great art and great music and great sound effects going on. And, basically it became what was widely considered to be the first successful video game from a movie franchise ever. There had been a Raiders of the Lost Ark, and there'd been a couple others, but they were not very well received, I think, in general. So,
for instance,
there was E.T., of course, too, but E.T. has its own reasons. But anyway, so the philosophy that worked was quite simply create a game that would be a good game even if it didn't have a movie license associated with it, and put it in the world, the universe of that movie. And you've got now a game that would sell whether it was a Ghostbusters game or not, and you also have the Ghostbusters license. So, and you had a game that I could finish in 3 months because I already had 9 months worth of work on this other game, under the hood. So it was an interesting story. The Atari 2600 version was done by Dan Kitchen, and doing what I did on the Commodore 64, doing a reasonable job of that on the Atari 2600 was a fabulous job. I'm not really familiar with some of the other, you mentioned Sega Master Systems. I'm not too familiar with that game, so can't really comment.
Yeah, I think the one I played was the NES version.
Yeah.
So it's
It wasn't me.
It wasn't you, huh? So if you actually had the proper amount of time to build a game from the ground up, did you ever consider what that might look like if you didn't have to repurpose something else?
No, never thought about it. Every time you make a game, you are constrained. You're constrained by the hardware in many cases. You're constrained by schedule. You're constrained by costs. It was so prevalent in those days that if you sold a game by Thanksgiving, you'd have great Christmas sales. If you sold it by December 15th, you wouldn't sell it, a one, because after Christmas, nobody wants them. Then you get into the summer and people weren't playing video games. So it was very constrained by all of those things. Now, the fact is, I loved working within hardware constraints. There's nothing finer than making the Atari 2600 do something that nobody else could figure out how to do, and turning it into a game. So the fact that I was constrained by A, schedule, and B, 9 months of work that I had already done, just told me what game I was going to design. If I went back and started from scratch, it might be something entirely different. Who knows?
Yeah, I personally think that's what makes a lot of the older hardware so enjoyable and so intriguing, is that you have these constraints. And so the creative power that has to go into developing these games is a lot greater than something where just, all the assets are there, all the money is there. You just kind of do whatever you want, and there's really no thought that goes into them. And it really makes for very special experiences when you have to get creative with your design versus just like throwing it out there and seeing if it sticks. If that makes sense.
Yeah, one of the fun experiences I had was working at Atari. I was pretty much on my way out, but I was still at Atari. And I was doing something really special with the hardware on the screen. And I felt a presence standing behind me, and I turned around, and it was Jay Miner, who was the designer of the Atari TIA, the video chip. And he was just shaking his head and mumbling, I had no idea my hardware could do that. So if I could do something that even the guy who designed the hardware had no idea it would do, I knew I had done something.
That's great.
And on that same subject, there's a textbook called Racing the Beam. I highly recommend it. It was intended to be part of a series, and I'm not sure if there have been others written for it, but the concept behind the textbook is that the console has a major effect on the games made for that console. So it directs, the games that you'll find. And so it's really thinking along those lines. It's saying it's the limitations of the hardware have this effect on the games that you will play. So if you find that interesting, I recommend that book for you.
Yeah, I made a note of that. I'm definitely going to be checking it out. For me personally, the thing I'm most excited about this year is a little handheld console called the Playdate, and it just has a D-pad, 2 face buttons, and a crank on the side, and it's just monochrome screen, nothing fancy. But when you have something like that, if you're going to develop something for it, it's going to end up being something special because you have to work around the hardware at that point. It's just you just can't come up with some elaborate idea and just hope it's good. It really is. You have to really think about it, and I really appreciate that. I really appreciate when you have these hardware constraints, and it forces the designer to really consider what they're doing and how they can do it. And I think that actually drives creativity more so than anything else.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting that video game handheld.
Yeah,
I definitely think it's looking pretty good. And if you want to start looking into this, David, you might be able to be a good programmer for it.
Yeah, could be brilliant. Could be
One of
brilliant.
those simple is better consoles.
MC Max 05 has a couple questions. He wants to know if Jack Black is Pitfall Harry's son.
Yeah, Jack Black was in a Pitfall commercial. It was actually, I believe, his first ever acting gig. He was about 12 years old. And you can see him. I have the video, and I'll show the video when I do talks at shows or whatever. And you can see the audience slowly realize who it is, and then their eyes light up. And yes, he was a 12-year-old kid playing Pitfall. And so I don't know that he's Pitfall Harry's son, but his first acting gig, uncredited. It's not. I didn't even see it in his IMDb, although he's very happy to admit it. I mean, he remembers those days fondly.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that commercial. It's really good. It really is. They also, I don't know what this reference is, but they said one for The Simpsons. Where's Camp Deadly? I've been in an argument about the location of that place.
I have no idea where Camp Deadly would have been located. It was just a video game, summer camp.
So yeah, somebody else wants to thank you. You already answered some other questions, but just wanted to thank you for A Boy and His Blob.
That's for the NES, correct? NES.
I did a Game Boy version as well, or a Game Boy sequel, but A Boy and His Blob on the NES. I was not involved in the Wii version. I almost developed a second version for it for the company that ended up buying that IP. Company was Majesco, and we were in negotiations for doing a version, and that fell through. And then a couple of years later, it was done by Way Forward on the Wii. But nice. Yeah, I enjoyed that game. Gary and I killed ourselves. The schedule on that was truly insane. but I like the idea of doing a tool using adventure game where you didn't have to break the fourth wall or whatever and go out and look at your inventory screen. So you never pulled up an inventory screen. Your blob was your inventory. He was your sidekick, and you feed him a jelly bean, and he turns into whatever he's going to turn into, and then you use him in the adventure. Had a lot of fun with that.
The final user question is from just stated the obvious again. We really appreciate him for all these great questions. And he wants to know, were there any challenges working with the Transformer license?
Well, the Transformers on the Commodore 64 is one of those games that has a lot of technological innovation in it that you wouldn't know. Because those Transformers, by God, had to transform in the video game. And this is on a Commodore 64 with limited memory and limited program size and that sort of thing. And I ended up creating a complicated system that was kind of like, PostScript. I broke down all of the characters into 2D displayable segments. And then the decompression was to export them, to draw them using a PostScript-like language into memory when I needed them, and then pick up those images that had just been drawn on the fly and compositing them into an object so that the head could slide this way and the arms could slide that way. And it was kind of like, it looked like a color forms image that had all these pieces that you then compiled into a transformer to make and animate. And yeah, that was nasty. I mean, we didn't have 3D models. We didn't have enough ROM to have all the different shifted pictures and that sort of thing. So I ended up having to create this very complicated technological mess of drawing pictures on the fly when I needed a piece to then composite into a transformer. So it was a real challenge. There's some of the biggest sprites that have ever been on a Commodore 64. You look at that T-Rex that's walking around and the Transformers as they transform. There's also a really unique thing in that game that nobody knows about. One of the things that I did for that game was I streamed data off of the Commodore floppy disk. Or maybe, I don't know, I think to develop that technology for little computer people or whatever. But, the Commodore floppy disk, the driver inside the hardware itself was very poorly written. It was not efficient, not fast. But you could actually download new code into the 1541 disk drive, if that's what I remember the number is, and make it work better. So I ended up building a special driver that ran inside the Commodore 64 disk drive that let it run about 30 times faster than the existing game, the existing driver inside. That was fast enough, I realized, to actually stream audio from the disk into the Commodore 64. Now, they only had 4-bit audio, so it doesn't sound very good, but it turns out that on the flip side of the Transformers floppy disk, if you put that disk in upside down and run it, there is a complete story of the planet that the Autobots and Decepticons came from, taken right out of their cartoon show, with the voiceover of the guy who does the intro in the show. And it's about a 2-minute slideshow with voiceover that is streamed in from the floppy disk. Not a lot of people even know it's there.
That's pretty impressive.
That's awesome. Good to know.
Well, to wrap it up, I would like you to tell us about the last game that you worked on that's been released and what you're currently involved with, what you're currently doing.
Well, what is the last game I was involved in? Do we know?
I don't. That's why I'm asking. I'm very curious.
Yeah, well, little known fact is during the 2016 presidential election, Gary and I put out an iPad game called Political Pitfalls that is a fabulous 2D physics game that is themed for the presidential race between Trump and Hillary. And the philosophy is that each of the candidates are these rolling figures that roll down hills, and you have 3D or 2D physics engine, move this, move that, this bumps that, this opens that, Rube Goldberg type things. And you end up, every uncommitted voter that you touch turns into your party. And if you turn all the uncommitted voters into your party, you win that level. And there's 50 levels, one for each state, and you earn the electoral votes for the state by doing that. And it ends up has an election predictor to predict who would win the election as well. And it's full of the funniest sound bites that any of the politicians back then had. So you collect these medals of all the stupid things that they said, and fabulous gameplay, fabulous the sound effects, the music, 50 unique physics levels, 2D physics levels. And because it was a political game, Apple wouldn't touch it. And we sold about 12 units. We did it under pseudonyms because of other contractual problems or issues. So our names aren't on it, but if you can still get it, I don't know if you can, but Political Pitfalls on the iPad is a fabulous game. Someday we're going to resurrect it and do it as some other, characters or whatever.
That game will be mine soon.
I hope.
I was thinking the same thing.
Mine still plays, but I don't think you can get it off the App Store anymore. That's the thing.
That's unfortunate.
It was a 2016 thing.
That's the unfortunate thing with the App Store.
Yeah. So that's why, should I do any retro games, they will be complete inbox. They won't be electronic. So you'll actually be able to keep them and give them to your grandchildren.
Absolutely.
Well, I definitely think that there's a market for it right now. If there ever was a market, it is right now. I mean, we've I think I did a video probably about 3 years ago about the amount of professional people coming in and actually developing games for these abandoned home consoles, and we've really seen here over like the last 2 years that has really seen an uptick. And you're getting these AAA quality games coming out. I mean, it's not often, but last year I think we had like 4 or 5 on the Genesis, and we had 2 come out on the 5200 that were just A+ games. I don't keep track of a whole lot of other stuff beyond those 2 consoles, but it's exciting, and and I hope that we still see this continue forward with interest. And
well, I'm glad to see it. It's a different business entirely than what video games have become. It's really hard for me to explain to people that you shouldn't be spending 99 cents for a video game. If you want video games to be developed, particularly if you want them to be something you can hold in your hand and be complete in box, you need to be spending the equivalent of, we charged $39.95 in 1982 for Pitfall. In today's dollars, that's $105. Wow. So you're going to be spending, if you're going to be spending $70, $80, $90 for a game, you will get professional game developers back making games and putting them in plastic and selling them to you. You have a little more trouble with Nintendo because they have a lock on their system and they won't approve games for the NES and the Super NES. But for a lot of the consoles, as long as people are willing to pay professional developers a reasonable price for their work, then you're going to see people doing it.
I'm very curious. You said $39.95 was the price point back when you were working with Activision. I'm assuming that's the period that we're talking about. So what percentage of that covered the actual development of the game versus the cost of the cart? Meaning to say, like, if you actually had disc-based media back then, how much cheaper could the game have gone?
Well, that's kind of an amortization question. I mean, Pitfall was my salary for 9 months, and I didn't have a whole crew. That's another reason I was able to put my name on the game, is because I wrote every line of code, drew every pixel of art, made the sound effects, the music, wrote the manual. I mean, I did everything in the game. So it's really, you didn't separate it out. The company had fixed costs, they had people working, they had staffing, and then at some point they would say, well, we're going to have to sell X number of these just to make back our costs, and everything after that is profit. Hard costs, the Pitfall cartridge probably cost, between $10 and $15, fully finished with label and package, fully assembled. So there was margin there. You had to sell it to the retailer for whatever, $24.95, and then the retailer would sell it at $39.95, whatever the markups were back then. So yeah, it's really hard to really isolate it on any one particular game unless you just go back and crank the numbers.
So what are you working on now?
Nothing that's really of interest. What I do primarily as my day job, at least I did before the shelter in place and all the courts being shut down, is I work as an expert witness in patent litigation. There are patents that issue in 2010 that try to claim something that was done in 1986, and people have forgotten about already. And so, I'm often involved in doing prior art analysis of patents and things like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting work.
It's different, it's not as creative, but there's kind of like the scavenger hunt. There's the research of trying to remember that old game where some funny thing was done. And, I'm in pretty high demand for this because I was in the room and a lot of the stuff was invented if I didn't invent it myself. We didn't patent a lot of things back then either. That's the other thing, is we were immediately onto our new game, and we were innovating every day. I mean, you look at Pitfall 2, probably the first time that music was used to convey emotion in a video game with that minor key song. It's the first time I know of where you had a sort of a game save done by waypoints. Given that the Atari 2600 has no memory, there was no way to do anything else, but there weren't lives. You would get to a waypoint, and whenever you died between that and the next waypoint, you go back to the previous waypoint. So, it's hard to say, but again, there were innovations every single day. It was so natural. And so these days, patents come up that really just shouldn't have been issued, and we deal with that.
Well, David, you've been an incredible guest. It really means the world to us to sit down with you for a couple hours and be able to pick your brain and hear the stories. And it's an incredible experience. And we really appreciate you giving us that time.
I do appreciate your great interview with us, David. This was a whole lot of fun. I'm just a pleasure to get to meet you and talk to you in person. Very cool.
Have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you once again for coming on. Take care, Dave. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out. Until next time, you've been listening to the Our Retro Gaming Podcast.